Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. You already know what we are discussing on today's show. Beck is back. Carson Beck returning to Georgia for 2024, and I think that sets us up for a very fun conversation. It starts today, but will continue for months and months and months as we look about him as kind of the focal point, the nucleus, if you will, for Georgia putting itself in a championship contending position once again in 2024. Exciting to think that the starting quarterback, who I think impressed so many of us over the course of the previous 13 games, coming back for another run at it at Georgia in 2024. We'll talk about that. We will laugh at Dylan Raiola's poem. Connor Riley will join us on the show. National Signing Day is tomorrow. We'll set the stage for that here a little bit. We're going to do our best to continue to kind of cover all the news that's happening around college football. Not an easy thing right now, but we're going to try to put all that together. And generally speaking, just try to have ourselves a little bit of a fun time as we roll towards Christmas and we roll towards the bowl week and we roll towards the National Signing Day. And my gosh, could we do much more than we're already doing here in December? Seems impossible, but let's have fun doing it all. So we're glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We are so back, and it is a good feeling indeed. We talked a lot about on yesterday's show about the idea that as we kind of predicted, there was this kind of like period of slow trickle of bad news, a little bit here, a little bit there. Individually, none of it really mattered all that much, but collectively, it just sort of put us all in kind of a bad mood, an easy place to be on the heels of a lost Alabama and not making the college football playoff and all of that you by now are fully acquainted with and fully briefed on. There's just been a little bit of a, I don't know, kind of a malaise or a bad mood or something like that. It's kind of lingered day after day after day. And even with someone like me sitting here saying, eventually it's going to be good times again. Eventually there's going to be good news to talk about again. The good news is on the way. Eventually that'll be the case. Even with me saying that, and perhaps you cognitively already believing that's true, it's still one of those things until it actually gets here, until you actually have a little bit of good news to sort of sink your teeth into and enjoy. It's one of those things that the bad mood around Dog Nation just sort of lingers. Well, yesterday, all of that changed, and all of that for now has kind of come to an end because yesterday, Carson Beck stepped up and spoke the words that all of us have been waiting for Carson Beck to say. In fact, I happened to be there in the room when he made the announcement. I was able to take my microphone and slide it right up to Beck to get the official words from Carson on this. This is a DawgNation Daily exclusive. Carson Beck letting the world know exactly what his plans are here for 2024.
I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on. This is my home.
So obviously that's a little bit probably of a basic joke and fairly obvious, but nonetheless kind of a fun way to roll in to start our show here today. And by the way, for someone like me who puts a lot of emphasis on doing sort of a family-friendly style show, do you have any idea how hard it is to edit The Wolf of Wall Street so that it sort of fits into the confines of the show that we do on a daily basis? Obviously not the easiest thing to do, but reflective of the good mood that we all are in, I believe should be in, on the basis of the Beck news. Now, as far as like the real announcement from Beck, it was actually dropped on the Georgia football account yesterday. The quote from Carson here, my friends, and by the way, credit to Carson for A, writing this himself and not using AI, and B, not feeling the need to make it rhyme. He says, my friends and family have helped me put me in a situation to have options for my future. However, the NFL can wait one more year. I'm returning to UGA for my senior season. We need everyone's support in Miami to close this season out the right way. That is Carson Beck officially announcing his return for the upcoming year here in 2024. Now, I got a lot of thoughts on this in probably no particular order. Let me start by saying something that you've sort of heard me say before, which is as college football fans, and if you're with us on a fairly regular basis, then you are kind of like a deeply entrenched college football fan, as much the same way I am. College football's kind of always been my favorite overall pastime. I just enjoy it more than anything else, and many of you are kind of right there the same way. You just love college football. You're just into college football. And you know that most of our lives as like college football obsessives is kind of waiting for college football to get here. Whether that be during the season, like in the days between Saturdays, we're waiting for the next week's game, or obviously for months and months and months, we're waiting for the new season to start. Most of college football is spent waiting for college football because we have the shortest of all the sports in terms of the regular season, the longest off season. It feels like the stretch in between games during the season is also kind of sometimes an interminable wait there as well. So as college football fans, we do a lot of waiting, and we do a lot of talking about college football while we're waiting. In a roundabout way, this is all, whether it be Georgia fans or like college football fans in general, all we really want, and perhaps the only thing we truly have a right to ask for is in the long stretch of conversation while we're waiting for the new season to get here, can we find something fun to talk about? Do we root for the sort of team? Are we a part of the sort of fan base that has enough optimism about the upcoming year that the conversation we have while we're waiting for the year to begin, can it be pleasant? Can it be enjoyable? Can it be fun? And that's really, for me, the first thing that comes to mind about Carson Beck coming back, is the fact that it does invite Georgia fans to have a very positive conversation about what the upcoming year can be. I'm talking about in 2024. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence by saying, oh, guaranteed Georgia wins the national championship this year and Georgia goes 15-0 in 2024 and all that kind of stuff. They might, but I'm not going to guarantee that for you right now. All I'm going to say to you is, out of respect for your intelligence, is this clearly preserves Georgia's standing as a college football playoff contender in 2024, perhaps one of the favorites to win the national championship. The return of Beck clearly preserves all of that. That eventually we would have probably talked ourselves into something even if Beck wasn't returning, because there is just an element in which hope always kind of springs eternal as you kind of build towards a new season. But boy, that conversation is so much easier to have in light of Carson Beck coming back, because I think the version we get of Carson for this upcoming particular year in 2024 could be a very interesting version of Carson indeed. And I mentioned this yesterday while we were doing video in the immediate reaction of the Beck news, which was over the course of the last year, I've really grown to like Carson. I've really grown to respect Carson. And there was a time, and I'm just being as candid as I'm capable of being, I wasn't too sure what Georgia had in Carson. Now, I didn't come on the air and say that a lot because that's not really a fair thing to do. It's more of a hunch or like a intuition that something might be a little off, something might not quite be right. I would kind of liken this to, you ever see a house that's for sale, but it sort of sits on the market for months and months and months? There's a point in which you start to wonder, well, is something wrong with this house if it's just sort of sitting here on the market, it's not selling? And, fairly or not, probably unfairly, to be frank, when you see Carson come here in 2020 and you don't really hear much about him in his first year, when he has a chance to play that UAB game in 2021, but ultimately Stetson Bennett was actually the guy that kind of had the better practice week, and he stepped in and played well. The rest was history for him. And then you go on 3 years of Beck not really playing a ton at Georgia, not really kind of having his moment at Georgia. And you start to wonder, well, what does Georgia really have in Beck, really? Is this a guy that's just sort of been sitting on the market too long and, hasn't quite, taken advantage of an opportunity yet, so therefore something might be a little off with him so that he's not able to do that? And I think what you saw from almost the word go when the calendar year of 2023 began is whatever misgiving I might have had about Beck of wondering why he had never stepped up and taken that opportunity before, all of that was clearly erroneous. I think there was already positive buzz about him around this time a year ago, January, February, that he was taking it very seriously, the idea of looking like a leader and kind of being the kind of guy that could be a focal point for the entire team to rally around. There were more of those positive whispers around spring practice. He played very well in G-Day, and all of those were like the hints being dropped of how good Carson Beck could be as a starter. And while the Georgia end-of-season results are not going to finish the way that we all obviously hope they would for Georgia, that's not Carson Beck's fault. Carson Beck had a wonderful year for UGA. When you think about the growth that Beck experienced here, I think it puts you in an interesting position of imagining how much better he could be on the field in 2024 with even more growth along the way. In fact, I want to go back to last August for a moment. Kirby Smart kind of talking about Beck as a leader. and the fact that he was a strong leader for UGA already, despite the fact that he did not have a lot of game reps. And as you hear Kirby Smart say what he's about to say, and by the way, this is not a joke clip, this is a real clip. When you hear Kirby Smart say what he's about to say, imagine how much better all of this could be another year later with even more experience, now true, authentic game experience and kind of proof of concept of the fact that the place that Beck wants to lead UGA is a place that could be a very good place for these Dogs to go. This is Kirby Smart going back to August and all that.
You know, every leader has their own way, and he certainly commands the room. I think the players around him understand how bright he is, and they trust him. And Carson's had a lot of reps and a lot of work. They just hadn't all been game reps. So he's had a huge mass of reps against good defense, against really good defense in ours. So, but his leadership methods kind of still being developed.
Don't you love that? That, hey, he's developing as leader right now. We saw him kind of grow into his own as the starting quarterback over the course of that season. And by the end of the year, I would say that he really looked the part, so much so that he almost could have been a first-round pick here in 2024. We're led to believe that maybe that's not quite what was in the offering for him, so therefore he's going to come back to Georgia for one more year and show himself to be exactly the kind of quarterback prospect we all believe that he's perhaps growing into. That's a really exciting thing for Georgia to consider. Now, one more point on just the Beck part of this here for right now, and if you don't mind, Jake, can we throw the message from Carson Beck back on the screen again? Because there was another thing that Beck said, which I think is kind of a fun thing to consider here. At the end of the message from Carson about coming back to Georgia, he says, we need everyone's support now in Miami to close out this season the right way. And I got to tell you, that's no small thing to me. That's kind of a fun part of all of this too, which is much the same way that Carson Beck, in his announced return, gets all Georgia fans excited about the offseason conversation we get to have January, February, into spring practice, seeing how this team builds around Carson the upcoming year. What Carson says is that starts in Miami with the Orange Bowl. And I think for those of us who at times kind of worry and wonder, boy, college football feels like it's a little bit different. It seems like these bowl games don't quite matter as much. And it seems like there's opt-outs all over the place. We'll talk more about some of those as it relates to other programs here coming up in a moment. But Georgia, despite the fact that, it's not in the bowl game that it wants to be, kind of reminiscent of like 2018, 2019 when Georgia was going to those Sugar Bowls, being in the Orange Bowl this year is not the place you really want to be. But it seems like Georgia is fully committed to making the most of the opportunity. Carson Beck had already been practicing and already been kind of, letting it be known. We talked about this yesterday, his intentions to play in this game even before his mind was officially made up about coming back for the upcoming season. All of that kind of speaks to the fact that Georgia, I believe, wants to take this Orange Bowl game pretty seriously. More so than Florida State, I guess we'll find out. It seems like right now Florida State's in the midst of a lot of opt-outs. We'll actually, as the game gets closer, try to get a full picture of exactly where the Seminoles' head is at for this game. But, frankly, that's for them to decide and for them to worry about. On the Georgia side of this, the Orange Bowl becomes kind of the groundwork, the foundational level for everything that Georgia can build towards in the 2024 season. And just having another football game left this year, one that apparently the Georgia players are pretty excited about, I think that's a pretty good thing. I think it's a thing that we can all be kind of thankful for. That's Saturday after Christmas on December 30th. Georgia sounds like it wants to be ready for that game. Carson Beck gets a chance to play in that game, and when we watch him play, we will be watching a guy that's dropping a glimpse and a hint of how good he can be coming back for 2024. A return that I believe makes Georgia a very big part of the college football playoff conversation for the entire year coming up. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We're happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today, live on video. We start 10 a.m. across all platforms. Of course, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. Radio at noon, Athens Sports Radio 960, The Ref. Podcasts across all the podcast platforms. Just really happy to have you here, and really, really thankful to have our friends as Engineered Solutions of Georgia as a part of our program today there as well. I mentioned a moment ago, Carson Beck's return kind of lays the foundation for a great 2024 for Georgia. Well, if your foundation is not quite as well established right now as Georgia's is with Carson Beck, our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia can help you out with that, because foundation issues is one of the problems they exist to solve. And You can recognize this when you see it. Cracks in the wall, outside the house in the brick, inside the house on the sheetrock, or that kind of like crack in the floor of the basement where it's clearly one side sort of sunken lower than the other. Y'all, you know what that is. You don't need for me to tell you that. Perhaps you want to put off getting it seen about, but you shouldn't. You should reach out and talk to my friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia today, because they're a solutions-based company, and sometimes the stuff that seems like a big deal is actually not as big deal as you might think, and if that's the case, they'll tell you about that. But if it's a more, substantial issue, all the more reason you want to have Engineered Solutions of Georgia on the job, because they've got an entire team of engineers on staff. There's nobody else in our marketplace that'll put that level of resource together for you to help you solve your problems. And it's not just the foundation stuff. It's waterproofing there as well, because eventually a water leak issue or a water seepage issue will cause a foundation issue. And so therefore they want to stop that for you before it even becomes a bigger issue. And obviously if you see wet spots where they're not supposed to be, if you see signs of moisture where it's not supposed to be, once again, a reason to reach out to our friends in Engineered Solutions of Georgia. They've been longtime friends of ours here on DawgNation Daily. I'm so grateful for that. When I think about the holiday season and what matters to me this time of year, loyal partners like our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia, my loyalty to them is one of those things that I'm very proud of. Relationships matter, and we have a great relationship with our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. That's why I heartily recommend them to you if it comes to a foundation waterproofing issue. Here's the other thing. They're proud partners of UGA. I like supporting those who support the Dawgs, because it's kind of a fun thing to do. It sort of feels like we're kind of all in, once again, to use the same word, relationship together. They're proud partners of UGA, so give them a call. It's 678 ESOG now. That's 678 ESOG now. Engineered Solutions of Georgia is your solution for foundation waterproofing issues. Proud partners of UGA, longtime friends of ours here on DawgNation Daily. 678 ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, speaking of getting in touch with friends, we're going to talk to Connor Riley here coming up in a moment. Fun conversation today. But prior to that, and it's kind of a setup for some of what we'll talk to Connor about, I want to go around the doghouse. And obviously, the Beck news, his return, coincides with the announcement also that Dylan Raiola is on his way to Nebraska. And I'm going to get into some of this here right now. So let me give you like three more thoughts kind of on the Beck thing, kind of, and then sort of transitioning into the Raiola thing here for a moment. If you gave me a choice of BA, you could have one of or one piece of good news or the other, but you can't have both. Would you rather have Carson Beck coming back for 2024, or would you rather have Dylan Raiola coming into Georgia for 2024? It goes without saying beyond any shadow of a doubt that I, and I believe every other Georgia fan too, should at least prefer Carson Beck in that situation over Dylan Raiola. And that's not to say that Dylan Raiola is not a potentially promising prospect. Obviously he is. He wouldn't have been as highly rated a recruit if he wasn't. By the way, for those of you who are not aware, Dylan Raiola did officially flip to Nebraska yesterday. He's going to Lincoln to play for the Cornhuskers. But the better piece of possible good news Georgia got. In other words, if we were sitting here today saying, well, Carson Beck's going to the pros, but at least Dylan Raiola's coming to UGA, that would be a less, I think, enjoyable, a less meaningful piece of good news, because of the fact that Beck is a proven successful starter, and Dylan Raiola, even as kind of a premier prospect, is still a little bit of an unknown commodity. And what this speaks to for me is a little bit of transition for college football that's actually moving in a direction that ought to be maybe more enjoyable for fans. Now, there's all kinds of aspects of the change that we're doing around our sport right now that at times don't seem all that enjoyable. It's a little bit worrisome, and I'm not immune to that either. There are plenty of things that happen around college football now that are so drastically different from what the sport was even like a couple of years ago that you kind of wonder, is this too much change too soon? And, is this being pushed by radical elements and things like that? And or one day we're going to regret the way in which we allowed our sport to completely unravel? I think those are fair questions, and somebody ought to, ask those questions, and somebody ought to try to provide some answers to them. But that doesn't mean that every single change happening for college football is necessarily a change for the worse. I think one example of kind of some of the new stuff around college football actually being somewhat fan-friendly, I believe it's this. If you gave fans a choice, do you want to build for the future, or do you want to try to win now? In almost every single situation, not every single situation perfectly 100% of the time, but in the overwhelming majority of the situations, fans would almost always choose to win now as opposed to build for the future, because building for the future when you're a season ticket holder and you're buying tickets to watch games that are not all that fun, that are not all that meaningful because the opportunity to win at some distant time in the future, that's not all that great. When you think about, busy people who are, have time divided, tuning in to watch on TV a season for your team in which this is not their time to win, their time to win sometime in the future, that's not always super enjoyable for fans. Think about Major League Baseball, for instance. I grew up a big Braves fan. When the Braves make the in-season trade for a guy like Fred McGriff in the 90s, which obviously worked out, or trade, like for Mark Teixeira, a couple of decades later, which did not work out quite as well. But nonetheless, there's some excitement around that. It's a signal that, our team believes they have a chance to win right now, and they're going all in on that chance to win right now. There's an element of that fans just enjoy the idea of my team is in kind of a win-now mode. Well, what I believe about the current landscape of college football is, given the fact that, Georgia brings in, promising recruits, the Zeke Hayneses and the A.J. Harrises and guys like that, they don't play very much in their first year, and therefore they just move on. You feel like you never really got a chance to know them. What I believe that's telling about college football is there's only so much building for the future that you're ever going to be able to do. And so, therefore, the wisest course of action is to not be too focused on bringing a guy in, sitting him for 3 years in the hope that he's ready to kind of thrive for you as like a junior or a senior. The smartest course of action right now is to focus on who are the players that can help me right now. Who are the players that can do something for me right now, make me better on the field for this game, this upcoming season, this whatever else. It's almost kind of a borrowing of the phrase that Smart once made famous, the idea of win, W-I-N, what's important now. Well, I got news for you. I don't care how good Dylan Raiola ends up being in the sort of mindset and the parlance of what's important now. Dylan Raiola is not important for Georgia right now, whether he came to UGA or not. He was not coming to Georgia to be the starter here for this team this season, whether Carson Beck was coming back or not. Dylan Raiola is about the future, and right now in the current landscape of college football, I'm actually not quite so sure the future matters all that much. I'm actually not quite so sure that any smart coach, and this is a dramatic departure from where things have been, but I'm not really quite so sure how much any coach ought to be thinking about 2 and 3 years from now, just given the fact that you have zero idea of who's going to be on your roster 2 and 3 years from now. So the heightened importance of a guy like Carson Beck, the lessened importance of a guy like Dylan Raiola, I think actually kind of fits into with the mindset that fans kind of already have. Fans are already, in most cases, a lot more interested in winning right now, being good right away. Mortgaging the future is a phrase that you sometimes hear. Fans are a lot more interested in that mindset anyway than the typical coach or GM or player personnel guy or something along those lines. And I believe that college football is actually moving in a direction that sort of matches the fan mindset anyway. That's important to keep in mind. That Carson Beck is something that helps Georgia right now. Dylan Raiola, if he were to have come, would have been something that would have possibly helped Georgia in the future. But given the uncertainty around college football's future, the only thing you can control is right now. And so Beck is the much larger piece of news because it helps Georgia in the immediate present tense. A couple of other quick thoughts here, starting with this. When you look at the Carson Beck news dropping right before Dylan Raiola made his announcement, that's obviously, we would assume, probably not an accident. That's the kind of thing that sort of feels somewhat orchestrated, which most of us who are Georgia fans would say, good. That's the kind of thing I want Kirby Smart to do. This is the kind of thing that Georgia fans have liked about Kirby Smart. That ability to understand, not, sort of meathead football coach that can only think about what's on a whiteboard, that someone who can actually think about the landscape around college football and how to massage news cycles, to how to control narratives. And the Beck news dropping right before the Raiola news drop obviously is to a great benefit to Georgia. And that's the kind of thing that also makes Georgia fans, I started the show by saying we are so back. It's the kind of thing that makes Georgia fans sort of feel that way too, of, as chaotic as college football sort of feels like right now, and it does, no lie, no joke. College football right now, between transfer portal and NIL and just regular recruiting, feels about as chaotic as it ever has. In fact, more chaotic than it's ever felt before. That's all really true. But just because it's chaotic doesn't mean it's out of control. You can have control, at least some measure of control, even during the chaos. And that's what Kirby Smart shows you when the Beck news drops, the Raiola news follows, that as chaotic as this is, a player like Raiola, who had been committed to Georgia for as long as he had been, the whole family moved to Georgia, 30 miles from Athens or whatever it is, as a way of being closer to the Athens campus, and he ends up going to Nebraska. Y'all, that's chaotic. That's mass chaos. But even in the chaotic elements that college football currently provides, Kirby Smart can still find some measure of control. He can control the narrative. He can control the talking points. And today, I think people are talking more about Beck returning than they are about Raiola leaving. It shows you how savvy Kirby Smart could be. Now, finally, there's this. On the Raiola announcement, we are usually pretty careful around here about saying too much about players in a kind of a negative light anyway. We have a fairly big platform. You guys have been kind enough to give that to us. We try not to use it in a mean-spirited way. We don't really make fun of players. Never really have. Make fun of coaches all the time. They make millions. Make fun of them left and right. Now, if Raiola's making millions, I guess some of you would say, well, he ought to be fair game. Maybe that's the case. We still somewhat tread lightly on some of this kind of stuff. But if you think we're not making fun of this poem, you are dead wrong. Let's throw this on the screen here. So Raiola, in his official announcement, gives us this poem. In the realm of college football dreams, where purpose takes flight, entered Dylan Raiola, crafting his narrative in the night. Once lured by Georgia, where powerhouse glory gleamed, yet Nebraska's purpose in his heart brightly beamed. And it goes on, kind of like that. It's one of the corniest things you're ever going to see in your entire life. Some Georgia fans were a little bit upset by one of the lines in here that he's no longer a cog in some powerhouse machine. No, going to Nebraska, you are definitely not going to be a part of a powerhouse machine. You're definitely not going to do that. So we're not going to go too hard on Dylan because he's still a pretty young guy, and so we still have some respect for all of that. But making fun of a poem like this, that is absolutely fair game. And I think it serves as an important reminder here for just a moment, which is, you've heard me say this before, I'm kind of a lighthearted guy. I don't take myself too seriously. I think that I am lucky to have the most fun job in the world. But there is an element of the college football world that is changing a little bit. I do believe the sport's getting a little bit more combative. And I do believe the stuff around this is getting a little bit more cutthroat. When a school like Nebraska, allegedly using NIL, swoops in and spends big on a guy like Raiola at the last minute to take him away from Georgia, that's an element of the kind of the new world we're living in, where resources are scarce. Coaching resources, player resources, financial resources, spots in the college football playoff. Even in an expanded world, it's going to be scarce, and everything's getting harder. Tougher schedules, expanded playoff, all of that's the case. Like, the new landscape of college football is going to be even more cutthroat than the previous landscape has been, as cutthroat at times as that has seemed. And so I think the question you ask yourself is, well, how do you win in a much more combative college football landscape going forward? And it's certainly a question that should be asked. How do you set yourself up to thrive? How do you set yourself up, to win this current new world? And for those of us who are fans, how do you make it more likely that your team can do all of this? I know this is kind of an abstract point, but I'll sort of finish by saying this. My prediction is the side that wins, whether it's SEC compared to Big Ten, Georgia compared to Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State, whoever else, any kind of comparison, the side that wins, I believe, is going to end up being the side that looks like they're having the most fun. I know that seems like abstract and weird, but I do believe it's true, that ultimately a lot of this kind of comes down to choices. Like, where do you want to be as a player, as a coach? Fan base is growing and getting larger over the course of time. Where do people want to be? And people want to be where it looks like people are having fun. I got to tell you, last night, watching and we're going to do more of this later on for our golden shoes and things like that, watching the way in which Georgia fans were having so much fun with this. Like, I'm not quite so sure that the whole college football thing is not a house of cards that's about to topple. Like I'm a little bit worried about what the future of our sport even is, and yet we're all going to go out laughing all the way, because what I saw on social media last night with Georgia fans making fun of this poem and just making fun of the absurdity of, like, the entire thing right now was so fun and so entertaining, and just an example of one of the things that makes Georgia Georgia. That even when Georgia loses on a 5-star quarterback, we're all still winning. We're all still having a good time. We're all still looking ahead towards the future. We're all still laughing about the Raiolas going to Lincoln and living in the snow and using ChatGPT to write poems or whatever else. We're all still laughing and having a good time. And I think that matters. I think the currency of the new era of college football is fun. which side looks like they're having more fun, and on a daily basis, ain't nobody having more fun than us. And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Hey, Dawg Nation, it's Brandon Adams, and if you were joining us for DawgNation Daily a little earlier, had a little bit of an issue, so we're just going to do it this way, kind of relax and sort of low-key, and listen, it's Christmas season. My joy will not be stolen. My joy will not be stolen. Carson Beck's coming back. Santa Claus is coming in a few days. My joy will not be stolen. And so we'll welcome back Connor Riley to the show, a little bit different version of what we were doing a moment ago. And Connor, we had a chance to talk a little earlier about exactly what the Carson Beck return means. I know we're kind of in the midst of that, but I do, just for the sake of kind of clean start here, kind of shift gears to the next topic. And it's almost like anytime Georgia gets a big commit, like the biggest question we always get is, okay, well, what's next? Who's next? The celebration over a commit, a recruit doesn't last very long before you kind of move on to the next thing there. So from that standpoint, who do you think Beck's return could impact here? Obviously, number 84 is like the first name that comes to mind for me, but whether it be guys who probably are just coming back or guys that maybe are more likely to now come back because Carson Beck is also coming back, what's next for Georgia in terms of possible good news of other players returning here?
Yeah, I think, Lad is obviously the most interesting one here, a guy who did not have the season he thought he was going to have and has already put out enough tape for NFL teams to know what he's about. He's going to go and test very well at the combine, show off his agility there. But I would not be surprised if Lad elects to come back, knowing that Carson is coming back for another year, knowing the relationship the two of them have. Conversely, I would also, I would say right now, if I'm putting money on it, I would still probably bet on Lad going. But I don't know what those conversations between Carson and Lad look like. But I do like to think that Carson coming back for another year counts in the pro column for Lad in terms of coming back. I actually think the guy that I'm most interested now is Javon Bullard. Now, Javon has been sending out multiple questionable emojis regarding his status and what comes next with him. But in doing sort of a 2024 roster look ahead that I did on Monday, you can check it out on DawgNation.com. Safety was a position where, yes, you have Malachi Starks next year, best safety in the country, first-team All-American. But behind him, you do have a lot of questions there. And bring Javon Bullard back would answer a lot of them for me. Obviously, you have another young player in Janelle Aguero there. Georgia's not expected to bring in a safety in this 2024 recruiting class. And so if you have Starks and you have Bullard there, I think that answers and solidifies a lot of things. Other guys, Tate Ratledge, I believe he had sort of been planning on coming back even before the Carson news had come back. But I think with Carson, that only further solidifies it there. And I'll be interested in seeing, London Humphreys, wide receiver from Vanderbilt, Colby Young, a wide receiver from Miami, and then Trevor Etienne, the running back from Florida. Those guys had sort of all been trending to Georgia before the Beck news had obviously come out. And I'll be interested to just see, is that further locked in now that they do have an obvious QB1 in Carson Beck coming back next year?
Yeah, I think in addition to the Beck news, like you said, it seems like I hear different things about the Lad McConkey stuff, and I'm not trying to put myself in like sort of the insider spot here. I'm just saying, when you talk to people who know somebody, different people sort of think they have a different angle on that. And I have heard, kind of conflicting stuff there on that, which perhaps reflects sort of a conflicting, opinion for Lad McConkey. I would certainly love to think that the Carson Beck news could influence him, because I do think it'd be great to have him back. You and I talked about this last week. That'd be along the lines of almost like a Nolan Smith returning or something like that in terms of what it could mean for Georgia in 2024. But, the only thing I think that we ask for, those of us who are Georgia fans, can you point to a clear path for this is how this team either maintains or returns to elite status, whatever, version of that you sort of see as the better answer. Is there a path towards being a great football team in 2024? And, I think the Smile Monitor return, I haven't probably talked enough about that. I think that's a pretty big deal for UGA. A Javon Bullard piece on that would be pretty big there as well. And frankly, you hear a lot of chatter about, well, okay, Zion Logue's leaving. What if Warren Brinson comes back? What if Nazir Stackhouse comes back? What if one or the other of those two guys come back? I think a veteran presence along the defensive line could coincide nicely with the possible emergence of Jamal Jarrett as sort of that space-eating nose man of, Jordan Hall and, Christian Miller, who might be a little bit of a return to the kind of dynamic defensive lineman the best Georgia teams sort of have. Tate Ratledge come back on the offensive line would be a pretty big deal. that there are enough possible returns where, for Georgia fans who want to have optimism about the future anyway, it becomes a pretty easy conversation to have if the right combination of these guys do indeed come back.
Yeah, I think the two guys that I'm really interested in now are Brinson and Stackhouse on the defensive line, because while the defensive line is not the reason Georgia lost to Alabama, in my opinion, I think that it was a step back this year. And if you're able to get Brinson and Stackhouse back, those guys aren't stars. Now, Stackhouse made a huge play in the win over Missouri, obviously. And then I think Brinson is obviously a guy that has just played so much football, and that really helps this team out. They're bringing in 6 defensive linemen in this 2024 recruiting class. But I think, as we saw this year from Jamal Jarrett and Jordan Hall, as talented as those guys are, it's not a slam dunk that any of those guys, even someone as talented as Joseph Jonah-Ajayi, are going to be able to come in and play right away. And so I think when it comes to those guys coming back and what you potentially get there, the game that has sort of had me thinking the most of late with Georgia's season next year, it's not Clemson, it's not Alabama, it's not Texas. It's actually Ole Miss, a team that Georgia just kicked up and down the field for 4 quarters when they met in Athens. That game's going to be in Oxford next year. But Ole Miss is a team that has, I think, so far come out swinging with NIL, landing big names, potentially landing Walter Nolan. And, before the Carson news, I was wondering, obviously, look, Georgia dominated that game, and there are some inherent talent advantages that Georgia's going to have. But I think Ole Miss has clearly improved itself. If those two teams, if they're playing next week, what's the line on that game? It was maybe probably around Georgia's a 7.5, 8-point favorite. I think now with Beck coming back, you might see that line creep closer to 13. And I think Ole Miss is going to be a playoff team next year in a 12-team expanded format, in part because of what they've done with their roster. And the other part too, I think they have by far the easiest schedule in the SEC. And so that game, to me, maybe even more so than the Alabama and Texas games, is going to be, I think, a real litmus test for just where this Georgia team is. And if you're able to get guys like Brinson and Stackhouse back and not have to spend the significant amounts of money in the transfer portal to get, like, say, a Walter Nolan, who I don't think they're going to get, or an LT Overton, who I also don't believe they're going to get, I think that helps your team only more.
I think that's really interesting. I want to talk about the Dylan Raiola stuff for a moment, and I'll be completely honest here, which is that Kirby clearly, I believe, attempted to manipulate the news cycle in terms of the Beck news dropping, the Raiola news, which we kind of all knew was happening, coming right after that. I'm going to tell you, Connor, even though the move is somewhat telegraphed, it still works on me. I really don't have, and I'm speaking solely as, someone who obviously wants Georgia to win, really don't have a lot of bad vibes around the Raiola news here today. We had plenty of time to get used to the idea it was probably going to happen. It did happen, but you give me the choice of celebrating Carson Beck's return or lamenting Dylan Raiola's departure. I'll take the Beck talk over the Raiola talk, 10 days a week on something like that. But beyond just the idea that Beck coming back is a much bigger deal for UGA, what else should a Georgia fan think about the Dylan Raiola news that had also become official yesterday via ChatGPT?
Georgia lost a 5-star quarterback yesterday. Some people believe he's the number 1 quarterback in the country, a guy that has been, fairly or not, compared to Patrick Mahomes. And Georgia still has the number 1 recruiting class in the country. They still have a blue chip quarterback committed to this class. And even with Dylan Raiola, and I say this as someone who understands that everyone that has watched Jacoby White play is a huge fan of his, and Nitro Tuggle is a must keep in this class. And it sounds like Georgia's going to be able to do that. Even with those two guys, it's an extremely disappointing wide receiver haul. Dylan Raiola, and this is not a criticism of him, this is just a statement of fact, did not bring a lot of talented wide receivers with him when he committed, and I don't expect that to change in the coming days. I don't think we're going to see any 5-star wide receivers flip their commitments to Georgia. I think Georgia is going to have to get guys out of the portal at that position there. When it comes to Dylan, look, I understand completely why he made the decision that he made and what he ultimately elected to do. From his standpoint, if he goes there and plays really well, it's going to help him tremendously. And look, you look at some of the top quarterbacks in the NFL right now, which is Rayola's ultimate goal, made very clear yesterday. Lamar Jackson played at Louisville. Patrick Mahomes played at Texas Tech. Josh Allen was a JUCO kid and then went to Wyoming. You do not need to go and play for the best team in college football, a powerhouse program, and go on to be a successful NFL quarterback. The NFL will find you. And at a place like Nebraska, he's going to get plenty of reps. Nebraska has shown they're willing to spend for him. They're going to have to open up the checkbooks for other guys too to elevate and upgrade their talent there. My big issue with Dylan yesterday, and you did touch on it a little bit here, the PR sort of masterclass that Kirby Smart put on with Beck timing his announcement. I think if Grady wanted to offer Kirby Smart a PR class, he would absolutely knock that out of the park with what we saw yesterday. Conversely, like the Chat GPT poem, if that's like the best case in saying that, yeah, I just plugged this into Chat GPT and wrote it, and let that write it. Like that's the best case scenario with that poem. And look, we talked about this last week because I think last Monday was when it first sort of trickled out that Dylan Raiola news was coming in. And you and I are sort of in the same boat, same mind on this. We don't blame recruits here. We don't blame kids. We tend to look at the adults in the room. The adults in the room, I think, have once again let down Dylan Raiola here because I don't know how you can put out something like that where you refer to Georgia and refer to someone going to Georgia as just a cog in a powerhouse machine. Yeah. That's going to follow him forever during his time in college. And like if he goes on to lead Nebraska to a Big Ten title, something they haven't done since joining that conference, and if he goes on to lead them to a college football playoff, despite Nebraska only being a program that has one winning season since 2016, that's a huge accomplishment for him. But if recent history is any indication for what Nebraska is going to be, and I realize that having a quarterback and a talent like Rayola is going to elevate that, but if he does what Nebraska has continued to do, when Nebraska has been playing the Big Ten West for the last decade, like that's the sort of thing where you just open yourself up to criticism. You have people asking questions, what's going on here? And for a guy who I think is so clearly forward thinking and thinking best about how do I get to the NFL, I think that poem's a real unforced error. And like if Georgia wins a national championship during Dylan Raiola's time during college, I imagine that poem is going to come up quite often.
No, I think you're right. I think that's all 100% true. And then beyond that, I want to talk about signing day in a moment. But, the point that I made to my audience a couple of times here is that to me, it seems like college football as a sport might be moving a little bit towards the direction that average fan sort of thinks anyway. Fans don't want to trust the process. Fans want to win now. And I do believe that college football is moving to a win now sport. And this is not sour grapes. This is me being, I think, as objectively, honest as I'm capable of being. Like, Dylan Raiola is not a win now player for Georgia, so therefore I'm not sure he matters at all. And by the way, A.J. Harris was not a win now player for Georgia, so apparently he didn't matter at all. And I'm not trashing the kids, the players, anything like that, but you don't have any certainty of who's going to be on your roster 24 months from now. Like, the only thing that matters is who can help me win, like, the game I'm about to play or the season we're about to be in. I think, anyway, fans are very comfortable with a win-now conversation. I believe that college football is just becoming sort of a win-now sport, which is, the idea I'm going to bring a guy in and 36 months from now he may be a good football player. I don't care. And I'm not sure that Kirby Smart should care either. In fact, I'm not even really sure that Kirby Smart does anymore.
I'm going to use one of DawgNation at large's favorite punching bags here, Dan Mullen. In late November of 2020, he looked like he had Florida at least very much in position to go and possibly make a college football playoff. Marco Wilson throws a shoe. They lose to LSU. They lose a close game to Alabama. Not even a full year later, Dan Mullen's out of a job. Like, that's where college football has only accelerated and gotten to. And I think this Raiola, decision, one, like it makes a lot of sense for Raiola. If you're a guy who believes he is as talented as Raiola does, you should be trying to get on the field as quickly as possible. And Georgia, look, there are some positions on this team where, like, that's just really difficult. Quarterback, I think, is always going to be one of them. Before this year, I would have said linebacker was going to be one of them. But C.J. Allen and Raylan Wilson go out there and show, like, that's just something that has to happen sometimes. Georgia, obviously, going forward, and look, they've made this clear when they're talking to kids anyway. Despite Georgia, I think, ranking 10th in the country in snaps played by true freshmen this year, over 2,000 total snaps, you have to be wired a certain way to want to come to Georgia because, while yes, there are some guys that come in and play as freshmen. more often than not, you're going to be developing. Carson Beck's the most perfect example of this. It took him 3 years, 3 full seasons to eventually become a starting quarterback at the University of Georgia. And so far, that's worked out for him. And some guys, it works out really well as well. I think Amarius Mims potentially can still be a first-round pick, despite really not becoming a starter until the end of his sophomore year. And so you look at some of those guys. And then conversely, you can look at a guy like Lad McConkey, who was a recruit ranked in the 1900s. He's going to go on to become an NFL player. Redshirts after his first year, but by the 5th game in his 2nd year at Georgia against Auburn, he's out there hauling in over 100 yards receiving. Everyone follows a different developmental path here at the University of Georgia. And so I think, on an individual level, you need to be willing and looking at, okay, I might be waiting a while at some of these spots to go out there and play. Conversely, some guys might be thrust in before they're ready. But to your larger point, and to sort of tie all this back in together, I think where you were going, like, if Dylan's not okay sitting around waiting, and he probably wasn't going to be, then Georgia's probably not the place for him in the first place.
Yeah. And to kind of move this to a larger conversation about recruiting, like signing days tomorrow. And, look, the thing that Georgia fans care the most about is Georgia going to get good players? And in this 2024 class, they clearly are. So putting that aside for a moment, I guess maybe we'll get to some of that here in a minute. I kind of miss signing day as a thing. I just sort of miss signing day. And it sort of seems like signing day as a thing is sort of over, or at least it's over for now. And I mean, at one point in time, there was even some chatter like, oh, you may have some big national news. And it seems like even some of that's kind of fizzling here late in the process. Maybe not completely, but it just sort of seems like that the air has been taken out of the balloon, the oxygen sucked out of the room by, transfer portal, things like that. That signing day just doesn't quite feel like a thing as much anymore. Is this a short-term deal? Is this just unique to Georgia because so much of the hay is already in the barn? Or are we post-signing day era in college football now?
I believe we are in a post-signing day era as it is currently set up with this December signing date and then another one 6 weeks later in the first week in February. I think if you want to sort of recapture some of the magic, the drama around signing day, and I'm not the first person to suggest this, I think you have an August date and you have a February date look, Georgia's a classic example of this. For a long time, Georgia would save a lot of its work until the month of December, and you make big moves then. You think flipping Dalen Everett, landing Marvin Jones Jr. in the 2022 class. Most of Georgia's class has been secure and locked up since August. And so I think if you give, say that first week in August or that last week, or really, I think that first week in August, right as teams are about to start, fall camp and things like that, that's when you have that first signing day for a lot of kids who want to lock in, get this done, and get this recruiting process over with. The recruiting process has now moved, I think, much more to a summer session rather than waiting until the month of December. And so I think if you're going to continue to have 2 signing days, have one in August for the guys that want to get it done early, and then you have one in February for the kids that want to wait, or the kids that want to rely on a big senior season and try and get it done there. Because I can remember for a long time, Kirby Smart talking about the importance of that senior season when it comes to recruiting. I mean, that's just gone now because of how much work these teams put in early in the process. I don't think this December signing date is really working for anyone, be it players or coaches on the staff. And so I think if you're going to keep doing it this way, it's going to sort of just be most of these guys have been locked in for a while now. There are 0 uncommitted 5-star prospects in this 2024 class. Maybe that's a one-year coincidence, but I sort of don't believe it to be. So if you're going to keep 2 signing days, I would go with an August and a February. But I'm also just open to the fact that, hey, maybe we just do all of this in February and the guys that want to enroll early sort of quietly go about doing it. And then you have the big celebration in February.
Kind of let me take care of one piece of housekeeping. I saw Ken Holcomb say it looks like the comment portion of the show is not going to happen because we're in this format. If you can stick with us here, when I'm done with Connor, I'm still going to take your comments. I'm going to finish with Connor in a couple of minutes. We're going to roll through here, and I'm going to take comments. I'm going to do it a little bit different. We're obviously a very different setup here right now, you may have noticed, but I'm still going to take your comments. So if you're able to hang out, we'll give you some commentary coming up in a moment. It's kind of all dumped into the same place. We're not on DawgNation.com, I believe, maybe, but we're going to take some comments though in the format that we're in just a moment. So I want to talk about some of these players here in a second. I get the impression that for Georgia, nothing's going to happen tomorrow. Not like good news or bad news. For instance, like there's all kind of talk about Nitro Tuggle going to LSU. I don't think that's happening anymore. I don't think. And like all of like the sort of late ads of the defensive back Barnes or like the NC State committed wide receiver. Like none of that's happening either. That like if you go to like our website right now and look at the commitment list, that's who's coming to Georgia. And like we could have told you that 6 weeks ago. We could have told other than Dylan, I guess. We could have told you that 6 weeks ago. We can tell you that tomorrow. Like it's all just official confirmation of what we basically know now for a good while.
Yeah, unlike our producer's dad, Georgia got all of its Christmas shopping done in a timely fashion when it comes to the recruiting process here. I don't expect them to be any ads tomorrow. I know there will be chatter around KJ Bolden and some interest in when he signs. That is expected to take place at 1 o'clock. I don't believe he's coming to Georgia. I think that recruitment has been made very clear with sort of what they are looking for, and Georgia just does not like to live or reside in that neighborhood. It would not surprise me if KJ Bolden flips to Auburn. But at the same point in time, I just don't expect him to end up at Georgia. And I think the 27 commits that are on Georgia's roster right now will be the 27 signees that they have tomorrow. Now, there might be a few guys who don't sign, maybe one or two. I'd set the over-under at 25.5 and sort of see you there. But, 21 of these guys are going to enroll early at Georgia. I think something like 15 or 16 of them are already on campus and are going to be taking part in practice this week. Yeah. For a while, Georgia has prioritized early enrollees. They've led the country, I believe, in the last 2 cycles in early enrollees. I haven't done the math off the top of my head yet, but I would imagine Georgia's going to be up there once again. And so, they clearly prioritize getting kids in early and now really even getting them in even earlier. You think back, Oscar Delp talking about matching up with Trayvon Walker, Michael Williams going against Broderick Jones and Jamari Sawyer, getting double teamed by them. This is something that they've done for a while. CJ Allen and Rayola Moson last year sort of turning heads, but in that run up to the national championship game. And at the end of the first year, they're already playing. So, when it comes to tomorrow, as much as, the lack of fireworks we're going to have, Kirby Smart's not obviously going to gush and say a whole lot about these guys, but there is going to be some intel out there in terms of how guys are playing and what they're already going out there and doing. And so the fact that you've got Ellis Robinson, the number 1 cornerback in the country, already coming in and practicing, that makes up for A.J. Harris leaving via the transfer portal. While it looks like LT Overton's going to end up at Alabama with his brother potentially, having Joseph Jonah Ajayi already on campus, I think maybe trumps that a little bit there. So I think that this is a Georgia program. Signing day is not what it was, and Kirby Smart, is probably part of him that laments that, because I do believe he loves to value the senior season, and he sort of loves the fireworks and the grandiose and going around the state to talking to these high school coaches. And so that has sort of been lost in this process with what signing day is, but Georgia's still going to have the number 1 class in the country. And at the end of the day, even though there's not going to be the big fireworks, Georgia put in that work in the summer so that they already know what their Christmas list. I'm at a point in my life where I just sort of send mom like, hey, here's a list of suggestions that are things that I want. So that way, when I wake up on Saturday morning, or I guess it's a Sunday this year, I sort of know what I'm getting and know what I'm expecting, but I'm going into the day happy, and I know I'm going to end the day pretty happy as well.
I also kind of think it's interesting that it seems like a lot of the chatter about the stuff around Georgia, not involving Georgia, the big news that could happen, it seems like now we're also kind of trending away from a lot of that too. And for instance, there have been all kinds of talk that Jeremiah Smith might go to Florida State. I get the impression now that's probably not happening. DJ Lagway may leave Florida and go to Texas A&M. Get the impression that's not happening. I know Auburn's in play for KJ Bolden, but I believe if I was betting today, I think Bolden did go to Florida State this past weekend, that might have been enough to sort of quiet some of that down if I had to guess. I reckon Edric Houston may go to Alabama maybe, but a lot of these like sort of big names, even that have nothing to do with Georgia, it seems like even the rumblings and grumblings of, they may flip, it seems like even that's kind of quieted down now. Is there a big like national story beyond Georgia that's interesting for you tomorrow?
Not really. I mean, it probably happened yesterday with Dylan flipping to Nebraska there. And so, again, there'll be flips, there'll be surprises. It's signing day. There always are. There always will be. But, the fact that we can probably count on our hand what they are, I think sort of speaks to what this day has become. I know as someone who covers it and has covered it for a while and likes to think he does a good job of it, I used to love this day as much as any in the college football calendar just because of what it means and where it shows the sport is heading. And the transfer portal, in part, has just so trumped what this day is, in part because you have a lot of guys who, Georgia signed, I think, 25, 26 players in last year's signing class. 2 of them are already gone in Yazid Haynes and AJ Harris. And so if you're a fan, there's probably part of you wondering, okay, yeah, some of these guys might get on the field next year. Some of these guys might be transferring and playing for our rivals a year from now. And so I think the transfer portal has undoubtedly hurt National Signing Day. It's killed the bowls. And while I'm pro player movement and the ability for guys to move on, I think the thing that most older college football fans or, traditional college football fans have loved, the transfer portal in my mind, and, you can lump NIL into this as well, has sort of gravely hurt the things that fans care about the most. And, bowl season has obviously lost its luster. And I think signing day this year in particular has only furthered that case.
All right, absolute last thing from me, Connor. I'll give you a chance to respond, and then I'll take some comments from the audience, and we'll let you get about your day. I think the thing that I probably like as much as anything about Georgia's 2024 class, and obviously we can talk about Ellis Robinson, what an elite prospect he has a chance to be, and there's some, the 2 guys from Texas, Jonah Janye and Justin Williams. We could talk about those guys. But the element of this class that I probably like the most is the sheer size that Georgia's bringing in with its offensive line. I really like Daniel Calhoun as a player a lot. I know that Walton ended up not winning the state championship in Georgia this year, but I thought that Calhoun had a really good year for them. And Daniel Bruner, the Walton coach, really raved about his leadership and things like that. I think there's a lot to like about Daniel Calhoun in particular, but the other really big offensive lineman that Georgia's set to sign tomorrow, I think that's a really big deal because for all we want to say about transfer portal and things like that, for whatever reason, offensive line has not proven to be a big-time transfer portal position. Teams are not getting great offensive linemen through the portal. For whatever reason, offensive linemen just aren't transferring at the same rate. And so if you're hoping to kind of build for the future with any position group right now, for whatever reason, it seems like offensive line is the example of that. Because the best that I can tell is Georgia seems set to hold on to, some of the offensive line pieces it's had in the program now for a couple of years, and they have a chance to kind of grow into bigger roles next year, perhaps. That's interesting to consider for Georgia. Offensive line seems like a spot you can still do that. And in a year in which there were probably fewer elite offensive linemen than most years, Georgia betting on big. In other words, let me find the biggest offensive lineman we can go out and get and sort of bet on that for the future. Seems pretty smart to me. I really like what Georgia has done in the offensive line on this class.
The average offensive line commit in this class is listed at 6'6", 345 pounds. It's just a massive size. And I'll double on top of that. Georgia lost its last game in part because I think it got pushed around on both lines of scrimmage to an extent. They're bringing in, I believe, 6 offensive linemen, and they are bringing in 6 defensive linemen. They're very clearly acknowledging that they have to beef up, both in terms of not just the pure numbers in terms of depth, but also the size of these players. And so I think, the offensive line is a great point there. Look, I'm biased towards Daniel Calhoun. I played with his brothers. He, I believe, has all the makings of a guy that is going to be a very, very good offensive lineman at the University of Georgia and is going to be a big-time player for this program. Defensively, obviously, Joseph Jonah Janye is the crown jewel from this defensive line class, but there are some other really solid players in there as well, Jordan Thomas, Justin Green. And so I think with what Georgia did with this class, obviously, look, and Kirby Smart will be the first to tell you this. I'm going to ask him about it tomorrow. They need to do a better job recruiting wide receivers. And it's not just a Brian McClendon issue. I know people might make him the scapegoat. Okay, that's fine. Wide receiver recruiting has been an issue for Kirby Smart throughout his time at the University of Georgia. This is not a new issue. It is not related to Brock Bowers, in my opinion, for whatever reason. Georgia just does not attract consistently top wide receiver prospects. That's not to say they can't go out there and find them. They've obviously shown they can do that. Lad McConkey, Dylan Bell, even A.D. Mitchell, although he ultimately ends up transferring out. They've shown that they know what they're looking for at the wide receiver position. But when it comes to those elite guys, 6-7 months ago, you and I were talking about what does Georgia need to have in this class. A lot of people would have mentioned KJ Bolden, saying you need to have him, being from Buford. And look, there's going to be a lot of talk about the fact that Georgia only has one of the top 15 players in the state. To me, that's really not an issue. You've seen, and Georgia has sort of telegraphed this for a while with COVID sort of interrupting it. They are much more of a national recruiting operation now, more so than an in-state one, and sometimes that does lead you to miss out on guys. But to the larger point I want to make here, Georgia not having a Mike Matthews in this class, I think is probably the one guy I would take over anyone just because of what Georgia needs, I think, at that position. and just how dynamic Matthews is. I know Sammy Brown is a name that we talked a bunch about. KJ Bolden is one. Heck, even Dylan Raiola, who somehow counts as a Georgia high school recruit despite spending 6 months here and playing for Buford. It's a very interesting Georgia class in that it's a no doubt about it number one ranked signing class in the country. And yet it kind of feels a little disappointing based on some of the guys they had or some of the guys that they had missed out on. And I know that's a bummer of a way to sort of end this show. But look, Georgia's still going to sign the number one class. They're going to have guys on the lines of scrimmage that absolutely make an impact. You're going to have impact players, whether it be Ellis Robinson, Nitro Tuggle, or Justin Williams, who come in and make an impact right away. But when you look at the whole and look at what Georgia, I think, could have and probably should have done in this class, it's hard not to think of tomorrow and be like, man, if we had KJ Bolden and Mike Matthews in this class, I think that changes a lot how we feel about it.
Those are the two names that would have certainly mattered a lot for me. By the way, maybe not a great day to have a Buford green wall. I mean, maybe not the best aesthetic choice here for today. Connor, I know it's not the conversation we planned on having, but I do appreciate your willingness to pivot here with us on that. Really fun information. Look forward to reading a lot from you here over the course of the next couple of days. I'm sure we'll get together and talk on video tomorrow about some of the recruiting stuff that does take shape, if nothing else, just to kind of confirm the players that Georgia is bringing in. Certainly a strong collection of those players. So we appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Absolutely. As always, it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Connor. Now, for those of you who are still with us, we will take some of your comments. It's a little bit different setup. You can obviously see that. When we have, and listen, I can't talk about the technical stuff. I can't do that anymore. I'm just done. But when we do have two videos, it always concerns me that, people only sort of see one or the other. I do think we did a good job of kind of talking about the excitement about Carson Beck's return on our sort of original DawgNation Daily plan from today. So if you're seeing this right now, I would encourage you. I'm not trying to get a second click out of you. I'm really not. But I really would encourage you to go watch the earlier video, just because I thought it was I'm not saying I thought I did a great job, but I just thought it was the appropriate conversation to have today in terms of what I think is really a great piece of news, that Carson Beck is coming back. So we'll kind of think of this as sort of our cool down here. We'll just take a few of your comments, and then we'll bounce out of here after that. And this is kind of all these comment sections sort of dumped into one here. So some of you, I know where you're coming from, and I can sort of see your little, the software that we use kind of shows me your little logo here, but it's all just sort of one thing right now. Barry Watkins, wonder if it's a Russian spy infiltrating our technical stuff. Somebody else mentioned, and I think this may be more like it, if the Rayolas are using AI to write their poetry, are they perhaps using that to infiltrate some of the shows such as this one? I would say there's maybe a chance that's a possibility. Could be there's a chance that's a possibility. Jonathan Aaron wonder if I'm going to write a poem for my love of Jimbo Fisher. I'm not really quite so sure how good of a poem I could probably write. In fact, I'm not really sure the last time I thought of a poem before yesterday. Like, when was the last time that in your life you actually thought about a poem? Like, I'm not sure I ever have. I mean, if maybe you love poetry, and if you do, I'm not here to knock that. I'm just saying, for me personally, poetry's not a big part of my life on a regular basis. Maybe it should be. Maybe it'd be more cultured if it was, but it's not. But boy, I was thinking about one yesterday. I was. Realistic One says, coming out of high school, I thought Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint was going to be an NFL, first round type guy. Did UGA not use him correctly, or did he underachieve, or both? I think a couple of things go on there for Rosemy-Jacksaint. First of all, we may never exactly know how good he could have been if not for a very, very serious injury he suffered in 2020. I think on the other side of that, Rosemy-Jacksaint's proven to be a pretty good player. I do believe that, Georgia's also had a pretty crowded situation at wide receiver. You can say that the overall wide receiver talent at Georgia is somewhat underwhelmed. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But I do believe that some of the diminished numbers for Rosemy-Jacksaint may have been attributed to the fact there were other good wide receivers around him. I have been very glad that Georgia has had Rosemy-Jacksaint. I'm sure you probably have been there as well. As far as developing into a first-round pick, I don't mean to be trite about this, but that is just a really hard thing to do. That obviously, when you're as highly rated as a recruit as Rosemy-Jacksaint was, you clearly have the potential of having that happen for you. But actually fulfilling that potential is still a difficult thing to do, even within the category of guys who sort of start off with that as a realistic conversation. So I guess that's my statement on that, that it certainly loomed to be a possibility. But the fact that right now it appears that it's not coming true, to me, that tells you more about just how onerous of a challenge that is, more so than some sort of deficiency about Rosemy Jack saying. Hair Gel says we need to change the landscape and narrative about these elite players. Because Downs was a proven commodity that could have been a key this year. The problem is when this format, the comments start to disappear, so I don't see the rest of what he said there. But if the point is there are some recruits who are different, but if there's some recruits who are different than others, I would agree with that. That Caleb Downs seemed like a sure thing. He's going to go to Alabama, and he's probably the freshman of the year in all of college football, right? He probably is the top freshman in the entire sport. And there are clearly a few freshmen that, especially in kind of the point that I made a little earlier about the transition, a little bit more of a win now mindset, that you're not really hoarding a bunch of players for the future. You're thinking about the guys that can help you right away. And, an NFL roster is only 53 players deep. And like moving forward, a college football roster should only be considered about 50 or 60 players deep there as well. For SEC road games, you can travel 70 players. Georgia never plays all 70 of the players that it takes. There are really only about 50 or 60 players in line to play in any given week when you're kind of in a real game conference play. And frankly, beyond that sort of 50 or 60, I'm not quite so sure anybody else really matters all that much, because I don't know that you can have a great deal of certainty that you're going to be able to hold on to them. But if it's a freshman like a Downs, or the versions of that for Georgia right now, probably Justin Williams, probably Joseph Jonah-Janye, certainly Ellis Robinson, probably Jaden Riddell, probably Nate Frazier. That's the five, right? If there are five guys who can make a significant impact year one, that's your list, right? Ellis, Jonah-Janye, Williams, Riddell, or Frazier. Is there another name that I'm not putting on there that I should? Because that's who my five would be from this 2024 class. Now, none of those guys are probably what Caleb Downs was a year ago, but I do think if this was the point that Hair Gel was making, and I'm sorry for not getting the full comment there, but if that's the point that he was making, there are a category of recruits that are different than others, and the category that I think matters right now is who is the potential immediate impact guys, and I would say the five that I just mentioned may be that for this class. Paul Moon says that once Bowers leaves, the wide receivers are going to get more targets. We could not throw it to the best tight end in school history while he was here. Not too worried about it. I think that one of the big questions for Georgia this upcoming season is, A, there will be more opportunities for more wide receivers, but B, that's massive production. That if you only counted Bowers as a wide receiver, if you didn't treat him like a tight end, his production fits very well with the best wide receivers in college football. That finding a way to replace his numbers is a very, very big deal. We said this before the start of this season. You look at Stetson Bennett's rushing touchdowns. We said that's a number that somehow has got to be replaced. And did Georgia effectively replace that here this year? I don't know the answer. I mean, they had a great offensive year, but I don't know that element of production was fully replaced. So replacing those numbers matters. Randy Martin asked a question that's on the minds of a lot of people right now. How's it looking with the young men from Vanderbilt and Texas A&M? So Connor Riley, when he joined us a moment ago, alluded to this, that whatever good news that Georgia's getting in the transfer portal, and I do believe there could be some good news coming, I think that's likely to come later on this week. I think the easiest yes for Georgia is probably London Humphreys, the former Vanderbilt wide receiver. I would say that you start thinking about Trevor Etienne and Xavier McLeod after that. And you mentioned Texas A&M. It looks like LT Overton is probably going to Alabama. That's what it appears to be the case. Walter Nolan visited. That's the other A&M defensive lineman. He visited Ole Miss this past weekend. So I guess there's still a chance that Georgia could be alive for Nolan, but my gut instinct tells me that's probably not the case. We've heard Nolan mention so many other places. Georgia had a deep recruiting relationship with Overton. We haven't heard that come up at all in this process. It seems like it's likely not to. So while I do believe that an Overton or a Nolan would probably be the biggest possible add that Georgia could make from the transfer portal, I guess instinctively I'm sort of assuming that's not going to happen. And I'm sort of looking more along the lines of the Humphreys, the Etienne, maybe the McLeod. I know they also talked to is it a safety from like Central Michigan or something like that? I don't know who that is, but Georgia also, I didn't know who J.R. Reed was either. J.R. Reed became an All-American in Georgia. So, the idea that I'm going to turn my nose up at a safety from a group of 5 school. I mean, when Georgia brought in J.R. Reed, he was supposed to be like the add-on, the sort of throw-in. Was it D'Angelo Gibbs? D'Angelo Gibbs and J.R. Reed were supposedly cousins. And so you bring in Reed as a way of kind of like paving the way for D'Angelo Gibbs. And no disrespect to D'Angelo, but it's J.R. Reed who goes on to have the great career at Georgia. So, the idea that a Central Michigan safety could come here and be really good, obviously stranger things than that have certainly happened for Georgia. Paul Moon says that Colby Young, that's the Miami receiver, could be Lawrence Cager 2.0. I don't hate that comparison. I don't hate that comparison at all. Cindy OG says we need defensive linemen. And listen, this is where, like, obviously we're all Georgia people and it's easy to have a pro-Georgia conversation, but I don't want to, like, participate in propaganda. I mean, I will tell you right now, and I'm also not trying to, like, fan the flames of hysteria either. I'm just trying to have an honest conversation. I think the question that Georgia's got to try to ask itself is, how do you get elite defensive linemen when you want to be a little bit more judicious than other programs are being when it comes to NIL? Because that's proving to be a very expensive position. I think this is a fair conversation, not along the lines of, Georgia's so far behind in NIL, everybody ought to panic, and not from the standpoint of, Georgia's going to figure it out no matter what. Within the two, like, extremes of sort of pushing people towards a panic hysteria and propagandizing and saying that everything's going to be fine no matter what. I mean, there is a little bit of a tricky landscape right now that does deserve some real, compelling dialogue around. And great defensive linemen, whether it be L.J. McCrae's out of high school or Walter Nolan's out of college transfer portal, they appear to be pretty expensive right now. That is a pricey position group in the NIL age. And if you are either unwilling to or unable to swim in those waters, what is your ability to attract big-time defensive linemen? That's a very fair question, I believe. Here's y'all mentioning Juju in the future or Jeremiah. I think maybe it's Jeremiah Smith this year. I mean, listen, I'd be very happy to see Juju or Jeremiah Smith, come to a place like Georgia. But if you told me right now, big budget, or let's say that I was one of these like big baller, type dudes, and I'm like throwing millions of dollars around. And if I was going to give 7-figure type money to Georgia and say, hey, go out and, buy yourself some NIL stuff, I believe I'd want to spend it on the defensive line. I do. I want to spend money on defensive line. Now, would I love to have Jeremiah Smith? Would I love to have Julian Lewis? I would. But I want to see Georgia get back to being just bullies on the defensive line of scrimmage, just mean dudes who make people want to stop playing football. I want to see that with the defensive line of scrimmage. I really do. Brandon Hote says, how is Lane, the portal king, Kiffin affording all these players? Well, they don't recruit very well in high school. And so they're making these big splashes in the portal because they can't really attract the high school recruits. They're not very good at that. The other thing about Ole Miss is, we talked about this during our cool down yesterday when we were kind of in normal circumstances. Ole Miss also has a very advantageous schedule this year. They don't play Alabama coming up. They don't play Texas coming up. They do play Georgia, but it's a home game. They do play Oklahoma, but they're avoiding a lot of the bigger, SEC potential pitfalls. And so we may see some of this because in most years, most schedules are going to be tougher. But given the rotational basis of schedules, there are going to be some occasional moments where the schedule gods do sort of give you a little bit of a break. And we may see more teams employ. I mean, like, I've been a negative guy about Kiffin a lot. I don't love Kiffin the way that some media types seem to. But this all seems really smart to me, that you don't have the resource to recruit guys out of high school. He clearly is having some success as a coach. They went 10-2 this year. That's something to shake your stick at. They have a fairly advantageous schedule for next year. So they're going to try to keep players. Their receivers coming back. There's a chance that Jackson Dart's coming back. Quinshon Judkins may come back too, right? They're going to go out and get Juice Wells. They may go out and get Walter Nolan. They did get Princely Udelman from Florida, right? They're looking at a chance to have an impact in the portal and take advantage of an advantageous schedule, an expanded playoff. If there was a 12-team playoff this year, Ole Miss would be in it. I think Ole Miss sees the future as pretty bright for them, at least in terms of this upcoming year. And if you can step in and have that success, well, now you perhaps generate the compound interest that allows you to kind of build off that from there. If they spin big like this and it doesn't work, he'll probably never get that chance again. But it's a bet worth taking, I think, anyway. Let's see what else. Chili says to top that guy on the show, they are saying they are not done, and B, all those guys announced already are coming back. Oh yeah, like the Chili, you talking about Ole Miss? Is that what you're talking about? I'm sorry, I missed that. I apologize, Chili, if I missed that. Yeah, I mean, they're going to try to bring back. I mean, the receiver, is it Trey Harris? Is his name? He's coming back. I think Dart may come back. I mean, they're going to be a strong roster. I mean, I would say that Georgia is probably still favored in that game, but maybe not by the Ole Miss guys. Chili, thank you. Yeah, they're in addition to bringing in all these portal dudes. Chili's right. They're trying to bring their own guys back too, and it could be a situation if those guys stay healthy. Georgia may not be a huge favorite in Oxford, Mississippi in a game like that. That may be a pretty narrow point spread. But we also kind of saw this. Remember, like in 2014, when Hugh Freeze had used his own resources to kind of put a big class together? What we also saw is when those guys started getting hurt, Ole Miss was not the same team. That you may have starters, both sides of the ball, that look as good as anybody's do. But when you're not really recruiting high school all that well, if you do have a spat of injuries, all of a sudden your depth becomes an issue pretty quickly. And I'm not hating here. I think that what Ole Miss is doing is the wisest course of action they could probably ever do. It's a risk worth taking because maybe you do get some good injury luck. But if you see a couple of those guys get hurt, you sort of wonder, oh, well, how was it Ole Miss was able to afford all these guys? Because that's all they were able to spend money on. Paul Moon on the subject of London Humphreys. Here's my deal on Humphreys, Paul, is we looked at this the other day when we talked about Yazid Haynes transferring, that he didn't do anything at Georgia as a freshman because freshman receivers just don't do much in the SEC. Every now and then we see a guy have a great freshman year, and so therefore it dilutes us into thinking that it's an easy position for freshmen to play, but the preponderance of evidence would suggest that it's not. There were 27 of the top 27 receivers in the SEC this year on a yards per game base. Only 2 of them were freshmen. So while the Humphreys numbers, like 400-something yards for the year, are not like all that like eye-popping, he was second best freshman receiver in the entire SEC. I guess what the Wilson guy from Florida had better overall numbers, but Humphreys was like the second best freshman in the entire SEC. So I think when you frame it that way, I think it makes a lot more to like about the potential Humphreys ad here. And I mean, I really liked having Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas on the team this year. I really liked having those guys with SEC experience on the roster. I hope that, in fact, that Georgia does more of that in the future. I kind of like that. Somebody mentioned Damani Jackson. Obviously, Damani Jackson was the former 5-star defensive back at USC. Clearly had a good relationship with Georgia's new defensive backs coach, cornerbacks coach Dante Williams. I mean, it's an easy thing to connect the dots to, but I haven't heard any kind of real chatter about Jackson and Georgia. Yeah, I'd love that to be true, but I haven't heard any real chatter about that as of yet. Chili says that Wilt Fong put in a crystal ball for Overton, Alabama. I have heard that. And Chili also says, as an LSU fan, we need more defensive linemen. Yeah, so it was, I would say that LSU this year, for whatever reason, probably did not get the year from Mason Smith they were hoping to get. Maybe that's just about coming back from injury. Maybe that's the case. And then overall, I think one of the bigger stories for me in terms of my own preseason prediction, I was pretty high on LSU to begin the year. I thought the transfers they would have brought in for this year would have made more of an impact defensively. They just kind of didn't for whatever reason. But the chatter that's out there is Overton in Alabama here right now. Maybe Damani Jackson goes to Alabama too, for all I don't know. It seems like Alabama's doing pretty well here right now. Zebulon Owen on the subject of Arian Smith. I don't know about Arian Smith's future. I think that's a good question. I think that's a good question. I'm not sure. Antonio Jones says he wants to see Georgia play Nebraska. Well, listen, I remember back when Georgia was playing Nebraska every year in those awful bowl games. So I'm actually sort of thankful that era is not going on anymore. But I do get the idea of there being a little bit of bad blood right now. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. As we say before, we don't really trash any players. We especially don't trash recruits. But, we're playing for keeps around here. This is a high-stakes game. And so, there is nothing more personal than business sometimes. And so having a little bit of bad blood around some of the way in which this plays out, I think Georgia fans are within their right to think that way. I think there's within their right to feel that way. All right, couple of more comments. Morgan Force says this is a business now, period. Sort of feels like that it is. Paul Moon says Nebraska fans have been bragging about a 2-1 record against Georgia. Yeah, those Georgia teams from that era, that's not much to brag about. Playing right now would be a very different thing. Antonio Jones says he'd love to see a Puglisi versus Rayola head-to-head matchup, and that would be fun. Listen, and, we're going to do a golden shoe around this. We'll save it for tomorrow. But, part of what makes all of this fun right now for Georgia fans is you better believe they're going to rally around Ryan Puglisi more so than ever. And, that's just fun. That's really fun. Justin Foster says, why are people saying that Kirby Smart's headed to the Falcons, which is why so many people are leaving? Kirby Smart ain't taking no Falcons job. People are leaving because that's what people do. We said this, y'all. You were going to have departures. Georgia's had about as many departures thus far as we expected. We're still on guard. They may have more. We're still, frankly, on guard that one of these may still be fairly big name. I'm not one of these guys. See, there are plenty of people who will tell you Kirby Smart would never coach in the NFL. Honestly, I don't really put myself in the never category on that, but he's not going right now. Sometime in the future, maybe could there be a clarion call that says, let me go try my hand in the NFL for a minute or two? Maybe could he consider doing that? I am not the kind of person to say never on something like that, but Kirby Smart's not leaving for the NFL anytime soon, or overwhelmingly likely that it's never, but certainly not anytime soon. David Stone says never, and perhaps that turns out to be true. I'm saying if there were 1,000 to 1 odds, 150 to 1 odds, something like that, I might throw a dollar bill down on that. Zebulon Owen says the Falcons need a total revamp. Yes, they do. Here's the biggest issue for the Falcons. In addition to just not being a very good team, nobody cares. There is total apathy, at least as far as I can tell, about the Falcons and their relationship with the city and state here right now. I'll tell you the simplest thing I believe I'd do if I was the Falcons. Instead of drafting a quarterback this year, I might trade for Justin Fields. I think at the very least, people would enjoy that more, which I'm sure is a very different conversation for perhaps a very different show. But that's what it would be. Let us get ready to go here right now. Jerry still says the NIL is the reason the 5 stars are leaving. Perhaps that's the case. But, y'all, I still think in some of this kind of stuff, we overstate some of this. I mean, a lot of this is the same thing it's always been. NIL age, portal age, all of that. It still comes down to players want to play. And the current mechanisms just make more of an opportunity that if you feel like you're not playing, you go try to find a place where you can play. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not quite so sure 5-star guy sitting in a place like Georgia, not playing at all. I'm not quite so sure how much NIL that's really commanding. Maybe some, but, I think we still overstate the NIL stuff that the average player gets. We may overstate it all, but we obviously know there's a handful of top flight players that are, especially at premium positions, they're maybe earning a lot, but a lot of these so-called former elite recruits that are leaving Georgia, they may get some NIL money, but they're not changing their life with that NIL money. They just want to go play. And perhaps it's the promise of more compensation. They start playing well that perhaps, provides that. All right, we're going to go for now. Sorry for obviously, all the stuff, just gestures, hands, and just the various directions here. But I appreciate y'all popping over here and having the conversation with me. We talked about the Carson Beck news and a little bit of the Rayola stuff off the top of the show, so you can see the other video and see that. And, of course, if you're listening on podcast, we're happy to have you there too. So y'all have a good day. We'll come back. We'll see you again tomorrow here for DawgNation Daily. We'll talk to you then, everybody.